December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. It is 5:30 in the morning. The darkness is absolute. The air is so cold it freezes the moisture inside your nose instantly. For the American soldiers stationed along this 85-mile stretch of the front, this is the Ghost Front. It is a place of rest, a quiet sector. Inside the log dugouts, the stove fires are warm, the coffee is hot. Men are sleeping, writing letters home, dreaming of the Christmas packages waiting for them at the mail depot. They're comfortable. They're safe. They are soldiers of the richest army in history, backed by an industrial machine that has already decided the outcome of the war. They believe the enemy is broken. They believe the German army is a corpse rotting in the snow. They are wrong. In the black stillness of the tree line, just a few hundred yards away, the corpse is breathing. 3 German armies, 200,000 men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. They have gathered in total silence, a massive, desperate predator crouching in the dark. They have dragged their cannons through the mud with horses to avoid the noise of engines. They have moved only at night, hiding under the canopy of the fir trees during the day. They are hungry. They are cold. They are fueled by a terrifying desperation. And in exactly 1 minute, they are going to unleash the single largest surprise attack on the Western Front, shattering the silence and the comfortable illusion of American safety forever. But before we go deeper, let me ask you something. If you're holding your phone right now or watching this on your screen, have you subscribed yet? If you haven't, do it now. Subscribe to World War II Dark Secrets. To understand the sheer insanity of what is about to happen, you have to understand the reality of 1944. History books often paint this as a battle between equals. It wasn't. This was a collision between 2 different worlds. On one side, you had the United States, the rich warrior. An American infantry division in 1944 was a marvel of logistics. They had fresh socks, waterproof boots, endless ammunition, and turkey dinners on Thanksgiving. They drove everywhere. An American soldier walked only when he had to fight. Behind every rifleman stood a supply chain that stretched all the way back to Detroit and Pittsburgh, pumping out tanks and planes faster than the enemy could destroy them. On the other side was Nazi Germany, the starving beast. By late 1944, the German war machine was running on fumes. They had lost the oil fields of Romania. They had lost the factories of France. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, had calculated that Germany had exactly 1 year of fuel left. After that, the tanks would stop and the planes would fall from the sky. The soldiers waiting in the darkness were not the elite stormtroopers of 1940. They were a patchwork force. Old men with stomach ulcers, teenage boys pulled from Hitler youth camps, sailors who had no ships. They wore recycled uniforms, they ate horse meat, and crucially, they lacked the one thing the Americans had in abundance: trucks. The German army in the Ardennes was using 50,000 horses to pull its supplies. It was a 19th century army trying to kill a 20th century superpower. So why attack? Why launch a massive offensive when you were bleeding to death? The answer lies in the mind of one man, Adolf Hitler. By this point in the war, Hitler was a man living in a fantasy world. He believed that the alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was unnatural. He believed that if he could just land one massive, shocking blow, the alliance would crumble. He didn't need to win the war militarily. He just needed to make the war so painful, so bloody, that the Americans would quit. His generals hated the plan. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, an old Prussian aristocrat, looked at the maps and saw suicide. Hitler wanted to punch a hole through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. This would split the British and American armies and cut off their supplies. But to do it, the German tanks had to cover almost 200 kilometers, and they had to do it in bad weather, on narrow roads, with fuel tanks that were half empty. General Jodl, Hitler's chief of staff, drew up a schedule that required German panzers to advance at speeds that were impossible even in peacetime maneuvers. They needed fuel to keep moving. It was a plan built on ifs. If the weather held, if the Americans panicked, if the fuel was captured. But the Germans had one advantage. The Americans were arrogant. General Omar Bradley used the Ardennes as a nursery and a retirement home. He put green, untested units there to get used to the front, and he put battered, exhausted units there to rest. The 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, had just arrived from the States. They were teenagers, fresh from training camps, expecting a quiet introduction to war. They had no idea that they were sitting directly in the path of the 5th Panzer Army. Intelligence reports had been ignored. American pilots had seen lights in the woods. Soldiers on the line had heard the clanking of tank tracks at night. But the commanders at headquarters dismissed it. The Germans are finished. They don't have the strength to attack. They were fighting the war they wanted, not the war that was actually happening. At 5:30 a.m., the sky tore open. The artillery barrage was so intense that men later said the earth bounced. For 90 minutes, thousands of German guns hammered the American positions. Trees shattered into deadly splinters. Dugouts collapsed, burying men alive. The communication lines, carefully laid by the Americans, were severed in seconds. Confusion reigned. No one knew what was happening. Was this a raid? A local attack? Then came the infantry, and they didn't just attack, they terrified. The German commanders had ordered their men to scream as they charged. American soldier Charlie Haug, huddled in his foxhole, described it as the most hair-raising sound he had ever heard. The Germans were coming. They were screaming like a bunch of wild Indians. It was psychological warfare. Out of the fog and the artificial moonlight created by searchlights bouncing off the clouds, white-clad figures emerged like ghosts. In the center of the line, the disaster was immediate. The 106th Infantry Division was hit by a sledgehammer. Their positions were overrun before they could even load their weapons. Young Americans who had been eating breakfast minutes before were suddenly fighting hand-to-hand in the snow. The German tactic was simple: bypass resistance. If a village was held, go around it. Keep moving, deep into the rear. Cause chaos. The rich warrior was stunned. The American command structure, usually so efficient, paralyzed. General Eisenhower was far away in Versailles attending a wedding reception. General Bradley was in Paris. The men on the ground were alone. But in the north, at a place called Elsenborn Ridge, the German plan hit its first snag. The 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by the fanatical Sepp Dietrich, was supposed to be the main effort. They were the ones who were supposed to race to Antwerp. They had the best tanks, the King Tigers, 68 tons of steel and death. But the Ardennes is not tank country. It is a maze of dense forests, deep ravines, and narrow, winding roads. The American 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions at Elsenborn were outnumbered 5-1, but they didn't run. They dug in. And here, the rich warrior showed his teeth. The American artillery. The U.S. Army had developed a system called time on target. A forward observer could call in coordinates, and within minutes, guns from different batteries miles apart would fire so that all their shells landed on the target at the exact same second. When the German infantry charged Elsenborn Ridge, they were erased. The American gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. They didn't care about conserving ammunition. They had millions of shells. They turned the forest into a meat grinder. The German tanks, the terrifying Tigers, got stuck. They were too heavy for the mud. They slid off the icy roads. They blocked the way for the fuel trucks behind them. The traffic jam stretched for miles back into Germany. Sepp Dietrich, the SS commander, screamed at his men to move, but you cannot scream a 60-ton tank out of a ditch. By the end of the first day, the timeline was already broken. The Germans had planned to be at the Meuse River in 24 hours. Instead, they were fighting for inches in the north. But in the center, the dam had burst. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by the aristocrat Hasso von Montefoot, had found the soft underbelly. They poured through the gap left by the shattering 106th. They were loose in the American rear. As night fell on December 16th, the Ghost Front was a burning ruin. American units were cut off, surrounded, and destroyed. Thousands of GIs were wandering the woods, leaderless and terrified. The roads were clogged with fleeing refugees and retreating jeeps. The Germans were advancing. The gamble seemed to be working. The starving beast had tasted blood, and it was lunging forward with a renewed manic strength. The rich warrior had been punched in the mouth, and for the first time in the war, he was staggering. The sun rose on December 17 to a scene of absolute chaos. The front line was no longer a line, it was a fractured mess of isolated battles and fleeing convoys. The fog was still thick, grounding the mighty Allied Air Force. This was the key to Hitler's plan. As long as the J-bows, the American fighter bombers, stayed on the ground, the German tanks were kings. But the Germans were not just fighting a conventional war. They were unleashing a campaign of terror designed to break the American psyche. Enter Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny was Hitler's favorite commando, a man with a scar on his face and a reputation for the impossible. He had rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop prison. Now he was tasked with Operation Greif. The concept was a violation of the laws of war. Skorzeny took English-speaking German soldiers, dressed them in captured American uniforms, gave them American jeeps, and sent them behind the lines. Their mission was not to fight, but to confuse. They cut telephone wires. They switched road signs, sending American reinforcements down dead-end tracks. They stood at intersections, directing traffic toward the German advance. The panic this caused was far greater than the damage they actually did. Rumors spread like a virus. There are Germans dressed as MPs. They're everywhere. Trust no one. The paranoia crippled the U.S. Army. General Bradley was stopped at a checkpoint by his own men. They asked him questions only a real American would know. Who is Betty Grable's husband? What's the capital of Illinois? When Bradley correctly answered Springfield, the MP didn't believe him because he thought it was Chicago. A general was detained by his own troops. That was the level of disintegration. But while Skorzeny's men were playing mind games, a far darker chapter was being written near the town of Malmedy. Kampfgruppe Piper, led by the dashing but ruthless SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, was the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Piper was a veteran of the Eastern Front. He had learned his trade burning villages in Russia. He fought with a cold, mechanical brutality. He was behind schedule, and he was furious. On the afternoon of December 17, Piper's column ran into a convoy of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. These were not combat troops. They were truck drivers, mechanics, radio operators. They were lightly armed. The engagement was short. The Americans surrendered. It was the sensible thing to do. They expected to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They were herded into a field near the Bagnez crossroads. About 120 men, standing in the snow, hands raised, shivering in the cold. Piper's tanks had already moved on, leaving a rear guard to watch the prisoners. Then something happened. A pistol shot rang out. Then a machine gun opened up. Then another. The SS troopers mowed down the unarmed Americans. Bodies fell in heaps. The snow turned red. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. After the initial burst of fire, the SS walked among the wounded. They laughed. They kicked the bodies. If anyone groaned, they were shot in the head. It was a calculated act of savagery. A few Americans played dead. They lay perfectly still as the boots of the SS crunched the snow inches from their faces. They held their breath as their friends were murdered beside them. When the SS finally left, the survivors jumped up and ran for the woods. They made it back to American lines, hysterical, covered in blood. The news of the Malmedy massacre hit the U.S. Army like an electric shock. Until that moment, many American soldiers looked at the Germans as just the enemy. Now they were monsters. The rich warrior stopped thinking about going home and started thinking about revenge. The order went quietly down the line: no SS prisoners. The brutality of the Eastern Front had arrived in Belgium. Meanwhile, the strategic situation was collapsing. The town of St. Vith, a critical road junction, was holding out, but barely. The 7th Armored Division had just arrived, fighting a desperate delaying action. They were buying time with their lives, but the German tide was flowing around them. The German target was the Meuse River, but to get there they needed to control the road network, and all the roads in the southern Ardennes converged on a small, insignificant market town called Bastogne. Bastogne was nothing special: a few churches, some shops, a town square. But on the map, it was the bullseye. 7 main roads met there. The Germans needed those roads to move their tanks. If they couldn't take Bastogne, their supply lines would be strangled. The race for Bastogne began on December 18. It was a race between the German Panzer Lehr Division, speeding west, and the American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, racing south from their barracks in France. The 101st was the elite of the rich warriors' army, but they were in bad shape. They had just been pulled out of the Netherlands. They were resting. When the order came to move, they grabbed whatever they could. Men jumped onto trucks with no ammunition, no helmets, and crucially, no winter clothing. They were driving into a blizzard wearing summer uniforms. They beat the Germans to Bastogne by a matter of hours. They set up a perimeter around the town, and then the trap snapped shut. On December 21st, the German forces completely surrounded Bastogne. Inside the perimeter were 15,000 Americans and about 3,000 civilians. Outside were 50,000 Germans and heavy artillery. The siege of Bastogne had begun. Inside the town, the conditions were medieval. The temperature dropped to 0. The medical aid station had been captured by the Germans in the initial confusion, so there were no surgeons, no morphine, and no bandages. Men were wounded and simply wrapped in torn sheets, lying in the cellars of the church, freezing to death. The Germans pounded the town night and day. Shells rained down on the town square. Buildings crumbled. The rich warrior was suddenly the poor warrior. The Americans rationed their artillery shells. They rationed their food. They counted every bullet. They were cut off from the infinite supply chain that usually kept them alive. But they had something the Germans didn't understand. They had a stubbornness that bordered on insanity. The paratroopers dug their foxholes in the frozen ground. They covered themselves with white bedsheets taken from the civilians to blend in with the snow. They waited. The German commander, General Luttwitz, couldn't understand why they wouldn't give up. He knew they were starting. He knew they were out of ammo. On December 22nd, he decided to be generous. He sent 4 soldiers under a white flag to the American lines. They carried a typed letter. It was an ultimatum. It stated that the Americans were in a hopeless situation. It offered them an honorable surrender to save them from total annihilation. They had 2 hours to reply. The note was taken to the acting commander of the 101st Airborne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe was a short, tough man. He was tired. He hadn't slept in days. When he read the note, he laughed. A surrender? Oh, nuts. He tried to think of a formal military reply. He couldn't. His officers told him that his first reaction was the best one. So McAuliffe sat down and typed the single most famous message of World War II. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. When the American colonel handed the note to the confused German officers, they asked, "Is this reply negative or affirmative?" The colonel smiled grimly and said, "It means go to hell, and if you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The bluff was legendary, but a bluff doesn't stop tanks. The Germans were furious. They prepared a massive all-out assault to wipe Bastogne off the map. They moved their heavy artillery into position. They gathered the Luftwaffe. They were going to crush the 101st Airborne and pave the roads of Bastogne with their bones. But while the paratroopers were freezing in their holes, checking their empty magazines, something else was happening to the south. The rich warrior was maneuvering. General George Patton, the most aggressive commander in the Allied army, was sitting in a command bunker in Verdun. General Eisenhower asked him how long it would take to turn his Third Army, which was attacking south, turn it 90 degrees and attack north to save Bastogne. Most generals would need a week. Patton smoked his cigar and said, "I can do it in 48 hours." His own officers thought he was lying, but Patton had already issued the orders. He was about to perform a miracle of logistics. He was swinging an army of 200,000 men on a dime. Thousands of trucks, tanks, and half-tracks began to move on icy roads. It was a feat of industrial organization that the Germans couldn't even dream of. The rich warrior was coming to get his children, and he was bringing hell with him. Christmas Eve, 1944. Bastogne. The town is burning. The light from the flames reflects off the low-hanging clouds, turning the night sky a bruised purple. Inside the perimeter, the men of the 101st Airborne are singing. They are singing Silent Night in their foxholes, while German mortar shells walk up and down the lines. It is a surreal moment of beauty in the middle of hell. But the situation is critical. The ammunition is almost gone. The food is gone. The medical station is a house of horrors where men die because there is no plasma left to save them. The Germans know the Americans are on the ropes. They launch their heaviest attack yet. They send waves of infantry and tanks against the thin American lines. They hit the western perimeter. They hit the southern perimeter. They are looking for a crack, any crack. But the paratroopers hold. They fight with a savagery that shocks the Wehrmacht. When they run out of anti-tank shells, they use bazookas. When they run out of bazooka rockets, they climb onto the German tanks and drop grenades down the hatches. They are not fighting for strategy anymore. They are fighting for each other. But courage has a limit. You cannot shoot courage at a Panther tank. The Americans need a miracle. And on the morning of December 23rd, they get one. The miracle doesn't come from the ground. It comes from the sky. For a week, the weather has been the Germans' greatest ally. Fog, snow, and low clouds have grounded the majestic Allied air fleets. The rich warrior has been blind. But at dawn on the 23rd, the wind shifts. The temperature drops even further, freezing the mud solid, and the clouds break. The sun comes out. It is a cold, brilliant, blinding sun. And with the sun comes the roar. It starts as a low hum in the west, vibrating the frozen ground. Then it becomes a thundering vibration. Then the sky turns black with silhouettes. 240 C-47 Dakota transport planes appear over Bastogne. They're flying low and slow, ignoring the German anti-aircraft fire. The doors open, and suddenly the sky blooms with color. Red, yellow, blue, and green parachutes fill the air. It is manna from heaven. The rich warrior is flexing his industrial muscles. In a single afternoon, the U.S. Army drops 144 tons of supplies into the besieged city. They drop crates of ammunition. They drop drums of gasoline. They drop blankets. They drop medical kits. And in a display of sheer logistical arrogance, they drop crates of frozen turkeys for Christmas dinner. The German soldiers in the trenches watch this with their mouths open. They are eating stale bread at horse meat. They are counting every bullet, and they are watching their enemy drop a supermarket from the sky. It is the moment the German soldier realizes the war is lost. You cannot defeat an enemy who treats gravity as a supply truck. But the transport planes are just the beginning. Now that the sky is clear, the predators come out to play. The P-47 Thunderbolts, the Typhoons, the P-51 Mustangs, the Yabos. For the German tankers, the clear sky is a death sentence. They are caught on the narrow roads bumper to bumper. The Allied fighter bombers descend like hawks. They unleash rockets and 500-pound bombs. The carnage is absolute. German tanks explode, tossing their turrets into the air like toys. Fuel trucks turn into fireballs, incinerating the columns behind them. The roads into Bastogne become graveyards of burning steel. The German offensive doesn't just stop, it evaporates under the heat of American air superiority. This is the difference between the two armies. The Germans have to hoard their resources. The Americans can darken the sun with aluminum. Meanwhile, to the south, the rich warrior is driving a tank. General Patton's Third Army is smashing its way north. This is not a subtle maneuver. It is a sledgehammer. The 4th Armored Division is the tip of the spear. They are told to ignore their flanks, ignore the casualties, just get to Bastogne. The Germans throw the 5th Paratrooper Division in Patton's way. These are elite troops, or they used to be. Now they are under strength and tired. Patton's tanks roll right over them. The American Sherman tanks might not be as heavy as the German Tigers, but there are so many of them. If a Tiger destroys one Sherman, 3 more appear to take its place. It is a math problem the Germans cannot solve. On December 26th, late in the afternoon, a young American lieutenant named Charles Bulge is commanding a Sherman tank named Cobra King. He sees the outskirts of Bastogne in his periscope. He sees the pillboxes. He orders his driver to gun it. The tank roars forward, machine guns blazing, smashing through the last line of German defense. A few minutes later, Bulge pops the hatch. A figure emerges from a foxhole ahead. It is an American paratrooper. He looks at the tank. He looks at Bulge. He doesn't cheer. He just nods. The siege is broken. The rich warrior has punched a hole through the encirclement. Bastogne is saved. But the breaking of the siege is not the end of the battle. It is only the end of the German hope. Hitler, in his bunker in Berlin, refuses to accept reality. He orders his generals to keep attacking. "We must have Bastogne," he screams. But his generals know it is over. They are now fighting a war of attrition they cannot win. The battle shifts. It stops being a frantic defense and becomes a grim, methodical extermination. The Americans bring up more artillery. They bring up more divisions. They start to squeeze the Bulge from both the north and the south. The fighting in January 1945 is some of the worst of the war. The temperature drops to -20 degrees. Men lose their toes to frostbite. The wounded freeze to death on the stretchers. The snow is waist-deep. It is a misery that strips away all humanity. The Germans are now fighting for their lives, trying to escape the trap they walked into. They are running out of fuel. Crews are forced to abandon their multi-million-mark Tiger tanks simply because they have no gas. They rig them with explosives and blow them up, leaving the hulks rusting in the snow. It is the ultimate symbol of the failed offensive, the most powerful weapons in the world rendered useless because the Empire couldn't provide the basics. And as the Germans retreat, the discipline of the rich warrior begins to fray. The soldiers have seen the bodies at Malmedy. They have heard the stories. The rage is boiling over. On January 1st, near the village of Chinon, the 11th Cavalry Division captures a group of German soldiers, about 60 of them. They are young, they are scared, they surrender, but the Americans are not in a forgiving mood. The memory of their murdered comrades is too fresh. According to eyewitness accounts, the Americans line the Germans up in a field. Machine guns are set up, an order is given, and the prisoners are cut down. It is a war crime, just like Malmedy. It is a dark stain on the honor of the victory, but it shows the brutal truth of the Battle of the Bulge. It wasn't a chivalrous duel. It was a knife fight in the dark, where the rules of civilization were suspended and only hate remained. The Americans walk away from the smoking bodies at Chinon. They get back in their tanks. They check their fuel gauges, full. They check their ammo racks, full. They eat their rations, chocolate, coffee, meat, and they continue the advance. The rich warrior has lost his innocence, but he has not lost his power. He is grinding the Wehrmacht into the frozen mud, mile by bloody mile. By the first week of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge has transformed from a strategic maneuver into a slaughterhouse. The bulge in the map, that terrifying wedge the Germans drove into the Allied lines, is slowly being hammered flat. But the Germans have one last card to play. One final, desperate gamble to prove they are still a world power. It is called Operation Bodenplatte, the base plate. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, has secretly gathered every remaining fighter plane in the West, nearly 1,000 aircraft, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, even the new jet-powered Me-262s. His plan is to launch a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. He wants to destroy the Allied Air Force on the ground, just like the Germans did in Poland and France at the start of the war. On the morning of January 1st, 1945, the German pilots climb into their cockpits. Many of them are children. They have barely 50 hours of flight time. Their instructors are dead. Their fuel is synthetic sludge. They are flying planes that are held together by wire and hope. But they have numbers. They launch at dawn. For a brief moment, it looks like the old days of the Blitzkrieg. A swarm of German planes fills the sky. They sweep over the Allied airfields. They catch the British and Americans by surprise. Parked Spitfires and Typhoons explode on the runways. Hangars go up in flames. The Allies lose nearly 300 aircraft in a single morning. It sounds like a victory, but it is a catastrophe. In their haste and secrecy, the German High Command forgot to tell their own anti-aircraft crews about the operation.
As the German planes fly back over their own lines, the nervous German gunners on the ground look up, see a massive formation of planes, and assume they are Americans. They open fire. The Luftwaffe is shredded by its own army. Dozens of planes are shot down by friendly fire. And even worse, the pilots who survive the flak get lost. They don't know how to navigate. They run out of fuel and crash in fields. The result is the death of the Luftwaffe. They lose over 300 pilots that day, including many of their last experienced unit commanders. The Allies, on the other hand, look at their burning planes and shrug. The rich warrior simply makes a phone call. New planes are flown in from England the next day. The Allies replace their losses in 48 hours. The Germans can never replace theirs. Operation Bodenplatte was the suicide note of the German Air Force. Now the end is inevitable. On January 12th, the Soviet Union launches its massive winter offensive on the Eastern Front. The Red Army smashes through Poland. They are racing toward Berlin. Hitler realizes the game is up in the West. He needs every man he has to stop the Russians. He issues the order to retreat. The German armies in the Ardennes turn around and begin the long, slow march back to the German border. But it is a march of death. The roads are slippery with ice. The American artillery is relentless. The Jabos are always in the sky. The retreat becomes a rout. German soldiers abandon their equipment. The roadsides are littered with helmets, rifles, gas masks, and the frozen carcasses of thousands of horses. The Wehrmacht entered the Ardennes as a modern army. They leave it as a broken rabble. On January 28th, the U.S. Army officially declares the Battle of the Bulge to be over. The lines are back to where they started in December. But the cost is staggering. The United States has lost 89,000 men, 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured. It is the bloodiest battle in the history of the United States Army. Thousands of American families will receive telegrams that shatter their lives. The 106th Division, the Golden Lions, practically ceased to exist. The 101st Airborne suffered heavy casualties holding the line at Bastogne. But the rich warrior can absorb the pain. The U.S. Army drafts more men. The factories build more tanks. The ships bring more supplies. The American war machine does not pause to mourn. It reloads. For Germany, the loss is fatal. They have suffered 100,000 casualties, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. They have lost the cream of their remaining army. The panzer divisions are gutted. The Luftwaffe is gone. They have used up their last reserves of fuel and ammunition. They have nothing left to defend the Rhine. Why did Germany lose? They didn't lose because of a lack of fighting spirit. The German soldier fought with terrifying discipline and courage. They lost because they were fighting a war of logistics with a romantic mindset. Hitler believed that will could overcome reality. He believed that if his soldiers wanted it bad enough, the tanks would run without gas. He believed that if he surprised the Americans, the U.S. economy would collapse. He was wrong. The Battle of the Bulge proved that in modern war, the factory wins. The rich warrior wins. The Americans won because they had the trucks to move an entire army in 48 hours to save Bastogne. They won because they had the planes to drop a city's worth of supplies from the sky. They won because they had the artillery shells to pulverize a forest just to kill a sniper. They won because they could afford to make mistakes, while the Germans could not afford a single one. The aftermath of the battle is a grim foreshadowing of the end of the Third Reich. The American troops who survived the Bulge are different now. They are harder. They are colder. They have seen the massacres. They have seen the camps. They are no longer interested in liberating Europe. They are interested in destroying Germany. The road to Berlin is open. The obstacles are gone. The rich warrior climbs back into his Sherman tank. He lights a cigarette, he checks his radio, and he gives the order to advance. The sleeping giant is fully awake, and he will not stop until the swastika is torn down and burned in the ashes of the empire that dared to wake him. The Battle of the Bulge was the last gasp of Nazi Germany. It was a gamble made by a madman, paid for in blood by teenagers, and crushed by the overwhelming, unstoppable weight of American industry. The war would go on for another 4 months, but after the Ardennes, the outcome was never in doubt. The beast was dead. It just didn't know it yet.